Welcome in, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Warchant TV. He's Ira Schoffel. There is also the founder and administrator, Gene Williams, warchant.com. And I'm Jeff. You're watching, and we appreciate that very, very much. Let's get to the bottom of how we ended up in this god-awful mess. If you're a Florida State fan, let's do that. There it is. It's on the screen for you. FSU versus the ACC. It's been going on for far too long, and everybody watching this wants to know when it's going to end, and is it going to end well for Florida State? But there is an origin story. There is a path that led us down this road, and how we arrived at a place where our hands have been tied, and frustratingly so, and to where the money disparity is on display for all to witness. Guys, it's good to be here with you as always. And I know we've got keen insight here. We were all here covering this. We were all watching it and play out. And at that time, I don't know that we thought necessarily it was going to kind of end the way that it has. A lot has changed in the years that have gone by since, say, 2011, 2012. And we kind of want to educate the audience, for people who don't know, how it is that Florida State and the ACC found themselves in a position of great disparity economically, financially, obviously, when it comes to TV revenue versus the SEC and the Big Ten. So, Gene, I'm going to start with you. I know you and I used to talk about this all the time, and we can go all the way back to Andy Haggard and his concerns very early on, and that'll take us into the conversation about the various athletic directors and presidents that have been here during this time period. But I'm going to let you lead off. Let's go back and kind of fill in the timeline for our listeners and viewers all those years ago, how the ACC and Florida State in particular ended up in this mess. Fire away, buddy. Anywhere you want to take it.
It's hard to believe it's been this. I mean, you go back and look, man, this stuff started a long time ago.
Yeah.
Really, I think 2012 is kind of the year to look at, because that's the first time that the ACC did, the first conference ever really, to do a long-term deal with a network partner. That I think at the time it was a 15-year deal they did with ESPN / ABC Disney, whatever you want to call that conglomerate. And it was pretty interesting the way they did this. So they did a long-term deal. I mean, also one of the things they did in this deal was give up the third-tier rights. And looking back at the ACC, the third-tier rights for Wake Forest and Duke, not really worth a whole lot. Florida State's, that's a few $1 million. I mean, they screwed FSU initially in there. And I remember driving and getting Andy Haggard, at the time the chair of the board of trustees for Florida State, to call me back. And he ripped the deal. I was surprised. He blasted what was going on. And you were like shocked that an FSU, a person in a leadership position, would do this against them. And that kind of started the whole ball rolling of like, wait a minute, there's something not right here going on with FSU and the ACC. And I remember a quote he gave me. It was very interesting. It was the effect that I've never seen a resume. I've never had a job interview with an FSU graduate where he put that we're in the same conference as Duke and Virginia. And that will go on. And we're going to get into some of the Eric Barron stuff here down the road. But that's very telling when you get to that. Like, I've still to this day am baffled when people tie academic of some other school in the conference with your school, like somehow it benefits you. It does. But anyway, I think that started the whole ball rolling. And I don't want to jump ahead and take it from there. But I mean, yeah, that really got this conversation started.
Yeah. And people should know too that, Gene, as far as giving up third tier rights and that kind of stuff, this has always been used as a bargaining tool by the networks, and as to whether or not, for example, an ACC channel was ever going to exist was predicated certainly on whether or not certain teams, in particular Florida State, were going to be in the conference. And Ira, anywhere you want to pick up from here, and you can add to Gene's insight, it wasn't willy-nilly. It's not as if the university or the schools in the ACC just decided one day to screw themselves. This was juxtaposed to some other TV deals that were going on and things that had happened with the SEC, and this idea of wanting to keep up. They just got played, but that's a whole nother story. I mean, they kind of felt like their hands were a little bit tied.
No, I mean, there was definitely it's funny, you go back to that time, and I think this is important to have this conversation because it does provide a lot of context for people who will ask the question. A lot of FSU fans today will ask the question, scream the question, why the hell did we sign the grant of rights? Why do we do any of the things we've done? Why do we mortgage away our future for this conference and these low payouts? But I do think it's important to go back to that time, because what happened was, they had just signed a long-term deal, But when Andy Haggard made those comments to warchant.com, and I was not an employee at the time, I was at the newspaper, so I wasn't real thrilled that Gene got that scoop. But it was a huge deal. It was like an earthquake in the conference, because now all the other schools in the conference are thinking, wait a minute, Florida State not going to be here? Because Andy Haggard talked to Gene about, hey, maybe we need to look at the Big 12. We need to look at the SEC. We need to look and see what we can do. So that created this instability, and there was concerns that Virginia might go to the Big 10, North Carolina might go to the Big 10. All these things started opening up. And so John Swofford jumped on that, and he came to Florida State's administration. At the time, Eric Barron was the president of the university, and Eric Barron famously, admittedly, was not a huge fan of spending a lot of time on athletics. And so now he's got this mess where he's getting bombarded by emails and calls from people in the fan base who want to get out of this deal. They agree with Andy Haggard. They don't want to be in this conference. But now Eric Barron's having to deal with something that he doesn't really even care all that much about. I think he liked what athletics did for the university in terms of being a window to the university and exposing it. But he was not TK Weatherall. He was not a president that wanted to really cared about athletics. So when John Swofford comes to him and says, look, man, this is going to destabilize our conference. We may be screwed here, and you've got nowhere to go. Nobody. Is the Big Ten going to take you? No. Is the SEC going to take you? At the time, the answer was pretty much a hard no, because of the landscape then, and we can get into this a little bit, but the TV cable model, all of that is not what it was, will not be in 2 or 3 years what it was then. So Florida State felt like they didn't have a lot of options, and they felt like they didn't want to go to the Big 12. That was kind of the last straw. And Eric Barron and a lot of people in the administration did not think that was an option. So they basically said to Swofford, okay, what do we have to do to restabilize this? And this is where probably their biggest mistake is when they did go back to the table. They didn't ask for anything more. They just said, okay, we'll do whatever we need to do to restabilize the conference. And that's what led to the grant of rights, the secret meetings, and all that. But that is kind of the Andy Haggard moment. Really is what kind of got all of this going.
Yeah, Gene, I want to circle back to you real quick on that moment. You had Andy's ear. You were able to talk with him. He was talking to you. How realistic was it? Was there ever a moment in which Florida State seriously considered going to the Big 12?
I mean, as far as I know, and all the people on and off the record said there wasn't any real contact with the Big 12. The Big 12 was making noise. You talked to them. Yes, we'd be very interested in Florida State. And, Haggard and some people floated that stuff out there. But in terms of it's any serious stuff ever happening on that, that's it. But to me, that's not the point. And something I can relate to negotiating some deals. And I know, Jeff, you have being with different entities through time. And this is we're 1/100th or 1/1000th of the magnitude of these long-term deals, especially we get into, shortly thereafter when they did sign that long-term deal with a grant of rights. Man, I'm sorry, but when you have something, this scared the crap out of Swofford in the ACC that there are rumors of the Big 12. You have what's called negotiation leverage. I don't care if Barron goes, not in a million years would I ever step foot in that crappy conference. We're not going there. But don't put it in an email. He literally sent out an email to fans blasting the Big 12's academics. Yeah. What are we doing here?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously this guy, like you said, does not know athletics, doesn't care about it. Obviously doesn't know jack about business or negotiation either. That die was cast from that point. They were stuck in the ACC once he sent out that email. Yeah. So to me, it wasn't so much was that a viable option, because when you go back and we started looking at this deal with a grant of rights that was signed shortly thereafter, what did FSU get out of it? I mean, they had all the leverage in the world. They got zilch. He commented all over and over, Barron did, about the stability of the conference.
Right.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Florida State, you're Florida State's president.
So what you're 100% right. And that email Gene's referencing, again, for people that were not paying close attention to this 11 or 12, 13 years ago, Eric Barron was getting bombarded by fans asking, like, what's going to happen? And let's go to the Big 12. We need to get out of the ACC. And he sent emails. Basically, I think he copy and pasted the same email to a lot of different fans. Then they started sharing it on the message boards, and then it got out in media. And basically, as Gene said, it was not like veiled shots at the Big 12. It was, this is, we want to be aligned with these universities, these prestigious universities in the ACC. We do not want to be in that conference. And the distance factor was legitimate. But to Gene's point, you don't, as you're negotiating a contract, you don't point out the reasons you don't want those other options.
Correct.
You want to present that there are those other options. And so, but I think, again, I think John Swofford, where he saw the fear and the lack of interest in Eric Barron being aggressive on that, then what they did was they presented it to the FSU Board of Trustees in those secretive meetings by saying, look, this whole conference could crumble. North Carolina might leave. Virginia might leave. You might be stuck with Wake Forest and NC State, and in a ridiculous ACC. You need to do something to keep them interested, and that's what led them down that road of the grant of rights.
Imagine going to arbitration as a hitter and telling those across from you who want to pay you less, I don't walk near enough. I strike out an awful lot, guys. I'm just not what you want. I really don't.
And my kids love the schools here. We don't want to move.
We don't want to move at all. I mean, just give me a little something. Just a little something, and I'll stay. Yeah, to credit Barron a little bit, it's obviously what sent us down this path to academic excellence. He was hyper-focused on that and wanted to raise Florida State's status academically. But obviously, to Gene's point, none of us care. None of us care about that. Ultimately, it's good for our kids who went there. But the truth is, Florida State set the tone early on to get taken advantage of by basically playing their hand or showing their hand. And it was the first big mistake, and it was one of many. So we move forward from there.
Can I just say one real thing on the academics thing?
Yeah.
Because the reality is what boosted FSU's academics was athletics. Because
of course, they're entwined always, yes.
Yeah, football becoming successful is what led to the increased application rates, which leads to, that's what gets it going. But if you don't have the interest in Florida State football, Florida State academically doesn't become what it's become. So anyway, I just wanted to say that.
So there was a lot done during that time, and we led up to the point that Eric Barron signs off on a 15-year grant of rights deal with the ACC in 2013. And Gene, I think you want to point out that they circumvented Florida Sunshine laws to get the Board of Trustees on board with that. I was trying to think of a way to serve that up without just stating it objectively, but that's what happened.
Yeah, it was. And again, we go back to, you look at stuff, you're a lawyer, about the spirit of a law. Obviously, as Eric Barron, being a state employee, your goal is to not circumvent laws. They're there for a place, a reason for this, especially when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars at stake for a university you represent. This probably needs to be out in the public space. I mean, that's why these laws are in place. But instead, he set up a scheme where Swofford could meet with each board of trustees individually to just, I don't know what the deal is if you have 2 or 3 in the same room. The Sunshine Law kicks in, so we figured out a way to get around that. And I think it's also important to point out during this time, you got to remember, a president should be relying on his athletic director. And unfortunately, the way this all worked out, you had Randy Spetman in at the time. And I don't want to go ahead and I think everybody knows not the best athletic director FSU's ever had. He was basically in there earlier for TK to be his yes man, following departure of Dave Hart. So he had absolutely no input or advice or any help from his athletic director at the time. It really was a complete cluster, perfect storm of poor, weak leadership in place at a time when Swofford swooped in, took full advantage of Florida State at the time, and we're still paying the price for that today.
Well, it's a great point to make, and Ira, you know this too. I've been pretty curt about this, but for years, Florida State operated in its athletic department unlike a lot of other institutions that were prestigious athletically. Florida State had puppets as athletic directors, and this was brought on after Dave Hart was forced out by TK Weatherall. Once TK took over, basically he was taking over the athletic department and didn't want guys who were going to push back or lead from the front. He wanted yes men, as Gene just said, and that started a series of hires at that position. And this is not to besmirch their character, but these individuals like Spetman and later Wilcox were guys that really were basically told to not do their jobs. I mean, this was all deferred to the president.
Well, there's 2 things going on there. Number one is when Randy Spetman was relieved of his duties and Eric Barron went in a different direction and wanted a new AD, going back to what we were saying earlier and his desire to kind of rub elbows with these ACC presidents, he took the guidance of, I think, Kevin White, who was Duke's athletic director, and hired Stan Wilcox, who was his number 2 guy. Mm-hmm. And Stan Wilcox is a sharp guy. He's a lawyer. He worked at the NCAA. He's now back at the NCAA. I mean, he's not he's an attorney. He's not like a guy that was a completely empty suit, but he was aligned with the ACC. So it's like, I think you could make the argument you brought the fox in the hen house. And
Correct.
so, you had another person. Eric Barron hiring Stan Wilcox was an effort basically to solidify FSU's partnership with the ACC. Again, I think the motivation there for Eric Barron is just keep this calm. I don't want to deal with this. Like, let's resolve this situation so I can focus on what I want to focus on. Well, the problem there, and this is why it was a perfect storm, is right at the same time, the deals for financial deals for conferences were going to change dramatically. And the SEC now is about to get a huge deal. The Big Ten is going to get a huge deal. And at the time, Florida State, Gene, what were we talking about at the time in terms of the disparity? I mean, it was maybe $5 million a year, somewhere.
Oh,
in that
yeah, I
ballpark.
think it was even less than that back then. I mean, it was $1 million or
$3
$2 million, I think,
to $5
initially,
million
and then
a year.
shortly thereafter, it started growing. But yeah, it was not significant at all back then.
So kind of the pushback from the ACC and the pushback from some people at Florida State was, listen, man, this is an athletic budget that's close to $100 million. This is not what drives the entire operation, and you can make it up in other ways. So it wasn't seen as a huge urgent concern, but that's where when you sign a 15-year deal, the landscape can change dramatically, and it sure as hell did. And just real quick on the sunshine laws, because I did give Gene all the credit for the scoop with Andy Haggard. Doug Blackburn and I at the Democrat won an APSE National Award, Jeff, for our coverage of that, because we wrote the story about those clandestine meetings, because nothing like that had really ever been exposed before, where this was an official plan. This wasn't like some private conversations. This was, a plan. They brought Eric Barron and their TV partners down to Florida in Florida, where we have open records, and had these one-on-one meetings with all these board of trustees who all then gave their rights to it. So yeah, I mean, it was at the time, it didn't seem like a huge problem because the numbers weren't as significant as they would become.
And if you recall, Ira, I frequently had award-winning journalist Ira Schoffel on the Jeff Cameron Show to discuss all of these issues. So yeah, absolutely. It happened. And we're building to a place where we get to the ultimate frustration. You're right. Landscapes change, especially over 15 years and certainly over 20 years, which later on we're going to be discussing. But we do have to build to the point where we get to John Thrasher agreeing to renew the grant of rights. And that's going to be another part of this series of videos that we do, I think, where we can kind of dig down deep into that. I do want to set the stage for that, guys, because where this culminates is eventually the SEC network being born, and a lot of people feeling the pressure to acquiesce to the demands of ESPN, certainly within the ACC, and the trickle-down effect of that being that, hey, we'll build you a network too, but you're going to have to promise us some things, like, your two greatest assets, Florida State and Clemson, are going to be there. And so a lot of what I think kind of fueled the fire for these poor decisions ended up being the sense of, hey, well, we'll never have our own channel like the SEC does if we don't agree to what ends up being terms that nobody would in their right mind agree with, knowing what we know now. Right, fellas?
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out this: the grant of rights was unprecedented too. No one had ever. There was a penalty. We saw Maryland ended up getting out of the ACC paying a penalty. This was the first time you're just giving up all of your rights. So it wasn't just a 15-year-old deal with a penalty if you get out early. It is, you are sunk for 15 years with absolutely no escape. And it's important to point out during these negotiations, again, we don't know exactly what was said, but you guys, both of you, I'm sure, have talked to people at FSU off the record. They were sure that Notre Dame was going to come in as a full-time member. I talked to two different administrators that were absolutely 100% convinced. They were told Notre Dame is joining as a full-time member, which I called shenanigans on right away, because I had a contact in the Big 12, and we were talking during this time. And when they were negotiating with the ACC, they were telling the Big 12 the same thing. But they ended up believing that this was just Notre Dame being Notre Dame and pushing their weight around to get what they want. So that wasn't going to happen. We also knew the big promises, and we can get into that more, about the lucrative ACC, network, what that was going to bring. And I think Stan Wilcox made a comment at some point. It was going to be $15 million a year for schools. per school for this network. And of course, they even lied about when the network was going to be launched, and it was pushed several years back. So a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of oral promises made during this whole negotiation of the grant of rights and the extension that legitimately were BS. They weren't there. And of course, again, going back to poor leadership, they didn't put any of this in writing, which is still, to my mind, when you're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars, baffling.
Yeah, and to Gene's point, Ira, I know you heard it too. I got into an argument with an administrator one time. He was very angry with something that I said on the air. They were straight up lied to. They were 100% told that Notre Dame was coming. That was the carrot. That was the whole thing. Like, well, imagine what this conference will be once Notre Dame joins. And I think we all heard that, amongst other things.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the reality is sometimes you hear what you want to hear. Like, it's the same thing with the ACC network. So it may have been how it was phrased. They may be able, under a court of law, like John Swofford may be able to say, oh, what I said was,
right.
Notre Dame's going to have to join a conference, and they're going to be required to join our conference if they do join a conference. I mean, I'm sure there's some sort of, legalese they could hang to. But the point is, Florida State and a lot of these schools heard what they wanted to hear, and that goes exactly with this ACC network. The SEC network, when it was launched and it created money, it generated money, there was a feeling like you were left out if you didn't have one. The Big Ten had one that was very profitable. The SEC had one now that was profitable. The Pac-12 was not very profitable, and it became their undoing, but they had gone a different route. The ones that were partnered with the network, like the Big Ten and Fox, or the SEC and ESPN, those made a lot of money. And there was a feeling like it was like everybody in the neighborhood had a nice car and the ACC was driving a beater. And so they were focused on getting that network deal. But in the reality, I mean, I think all of us who know this conference as well as we do, it was never going to make the money that the SEC network does or the Big Ten network. These schools in this conference, it's the inherent problem with this conference, which leads to all of the problems down the road, is this is a conference filled with a lot of smaller private schools that don't have huge alumni bases, that don't draw tremendous television ratings, even if they're successful. So that, to me, that's where Florida State lacked probably the most forethought, was at some point it's going to be about your what you can do on television, because these cable deals that were just printing money are going to end at some point. And once cord cutting started, I really think that was kind of the end of the ACC, because you couldn't force people to just pay through their cable providers anymore, which was what paid all those TV deals.
You wanted somebody in the room to just say, fellas, I don't know what it's going to look like years from now, but are we really going to marry ourselves with schools that have tracks around their football field?
for 20 years.
This doesn't feel right, fellas. This doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. Yeah, it was problematic. I can tell, have this conversation. It has tentacles. It can go a lot of different places. We could be here for hours, but we're going to break it up. So we've got you on the doorstep of more disastrous decisions, guys. And that'll be coming up in the next video here on Warchant TV.
But
the
light at the end of the tunnel, we're going to wrap it up with at the end of the series, guys. It's going to be 3 or 4 parts. We're going to talk about what the future might hold for Florida State, what options they might have. So
and some of them are actually optimistic. So hang in there with us. Hang in there with us. We'll find some sunlight somewhere in there. But in the interim, we do want to lay the groundwork so that you know how we arrived where we have. And it's certainly a fun topic because there's no shortage of opinions here, and we were all immersed in it. He's Ira Schoffel. That's Gene Williams. I'm Jeff Cameron. Until next time, thanks for watching Warchant TV and Warchant.com. Make sure you subscribe, pass it around, celebrate, and let's do this again soon, fellas.